Looking in Sunday evenings at the family, various aspects of the family, various roles. Last week we looked at the father's role in raising children, and tonight we're going to look at the mother's role. Now, last week we looked at it from a little different viewpoint, looking at God as Father and some of the attributes and characteristics that could be found in men who are serving as fathers. Well, this time we're going to look, and we're again realizing the power of examples. In the book of Ezekiel, the 16th chapter, in verse 44, the phrase is found, "As is the mother, so is the daughter." That was used in a negative way of people being wicked. But we know, too, that it can be used in a positive sense. We know the godly influence of mothers. It's been said that the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. And we realize how true that is. The influence, the power, the strength of mothers within a family, and how much it means. And so it's imperative that we look and we strive to find those things. We talked about this morning as far as being an example in what we teach and how that can be in all areas of our life. Well, that is true of a mother. Matthew 5:16, "Let your light shine." And we're blessed in this congregation with several mothers who indeed are that type of individual, who are shining examples of what a mother ought to be. Now, we're going to look, I've got 3 examples tonight for us to consider, and as you can only realize, this is the tip of the iceberg. You could look to so many women in the Bible, but these are 3 that I've always looked and admired and seen so many things in them that I see in other women I know and the godliness that they have as they are mothers. And the first one I look at is Hannah. Now, Hannah, you read over in the book of 1 Samuel about her, and she was the mother of Samuel. And we know Samuel, the great influence, the impact he had upon the children of God. And no doubt, as you read this first chapter, you see so much that was carried over to her child. You look and you find that the thing that stands out about her, first of all, is her commitment or trust in God. Look in chapter 1 in verse 10 and 11. And it tells us there that she was in bitterness of soul and prayed to the Lord and wept sore. Now, her husband, sadly, was a polygamist. And she did not have children. His other wife just berated her because of this. And she was very sorry because of this. She was sad in bitterness of soul. And what she did is she went to God. In verse 10, she prayed unto the Lord, wept sore. She vowed a vow and said, "O Lord of hosts, if thou will indeed look on the affliction of thine handmaid, remember me, not forget thine handmaid, but will give thine handmaid a man-child, I'll give him unto the Lord all the days of his life. There shall no razor come upon his head." And so there she gave an example of what she ought to do. Whenever you have a trial in life, what's the first thing you do? Sadly, in the world, people look, first thing they do, go out and try to solve it themselves. How many times have we found people who look and they have a struggle in life, and you try and talk to them about God, and they say, "Well, I got to take care of this first." Well, Hannah was an example, and no doubt passed it to her child, of a better thing. When you have a struggle or a trial, go to God. Go and see what His will is. Hannah, in verse 15, said as she was approached, and Eli looked at her and saw her praying, and he couldn't hear. All he saw was her lips move. He thought she was drunk. But in verse 15, you find here is how Hannah prayed. 1 Peter 5 and verse 7, "You cast your cares on the Lord." You know, sometimes I think we could be guilty of thinking about prayer as just something that's passing and fleeting. You know, well, God, take care of that. I'm on my way. Hannah, in verse 15, whenever she is accused of being drunken, she said, "I'm a woman of sorrowful spirit. I've drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have poured out my soul before the Lord." I mean, can you imagine? You know, Samuel was able to grow and to see this mother as she faced struggles and trials, and he learned the first thing you do is you go to God. If it's not big enough to be a prayer, it's not big enough to be a problem. She looked and she saw what God could do. Now the result was in verse 18, it says, she said, let thine handmaid find grace in thy sight. So the woman went away and did eat. Her countenance was no more sad. There it was. She found that she could cast her cares on the Lord, as we speak of, but she trusted him. And so many times, Samuel would face in his life those things, no doubt, that he needed to realize what you do is you trust God. I'm going to do it God's way. I'm going to go to God. I'm going to do it his way. And I'm going to have the confidence that he's going to do his part. So many lives are shattered because they don't have that example in their life. They hadn't been taught that. Samuel was given that lesson of trust, that all things do work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. And as Paul also said in Romans 8, if God be for us, who can be against us? I mean, God is there. He has given our promises. Why are we in bitterness of soul through our lives? Well, maybe it's because we didn't follow our mother's example of casting our cares upon him and having that trust. But also the trust that she had, she was determined to commit this child to God. As mother's role is to teach them, you trust in God, and before you were born, I committed what I was going to do with you, that I was going to raise you in the proper way, and I was going to trust God and teach you to trust God yourself. You show your children rather, that you trust God, you commit your children to him, and teach them to trust him the same way. It's an amazing thing to see godly mothers that are able to look at their children and say, before you were even born, I had it planned. What? Well, not your secular pursuits. They'll be godly if you follow the example, the teaching I've told you. But before you were born, I had determined that you were going to be a child of God. I was going to raise you in that way. I was going to get you to commit to God. Now, Hannah was able, as this child was small, to make that commitment for him. He was going to be committed to the temple. We as Christians, we can do things. Mothers tell their children, here we go, we're going to church. But they ingrain it within them, an example of having that same commitment, a desire for them. A mother's desire is so strong. I can remember, my mother, it was just almost like saying, sick 'em. I could talk to her, and she would just tell me what my abilities were, how wonderful I was. The older she got, the older I got, the better I got. She had a desire. She had a goal in mind for me, and she let it be known. And so mothers that have that, they're going to do it. And then they're committed to sacrificing the constant care that these children need. Even after Solomon was sent to minister with the Lord, you'll find that she went up to care for him. It's one of the things, and I've mentioned this before, my mother, I guess it was, it's likely the day before she died was the last time she told me that I was her baby. There I was, grown man, or as grown as I get, and she says, you're my baby. And I always would be. She was committed to her children. Hannah was one who no doubt looked at this child. You'll always be my baby. I'm going to always be there for you as a mother. The care. Whenever you'd later read, remember whenever we talked about fathers, how God, when he just wanted to have descriptive of him, the love and the care, he compared it to a mother's love. Well, Hannah's an example of that. She had that love. Now the result was, here's what you want. You want to see the fruit that's born. Now, children grow, they make decisions. And it's a sad thing whenever they don't follow the example, the teaching, encouragement that a mother gives them, but they have the ability to be like Samuel. Samuel was one in verse 21 who grew before the Lord. You know, you think of Luke, the 2nd chapter, Jesus as he grew. He grew in wisdom, stature, favor with God, favor with man. I mean, that's a well-rounded individual. Samuel was that type of individual, no doubt. He had that from his mother that enabled him to grow before the Lord. You look and you find that John wrote Gaius, and he told him, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. Think about that principle. Think of a mother as she looks to a child, and you know, we oftentimes say, you know, I don't do anything so that somebody will give me a pat on the back. Doesn't count when it comes to mamas. I wanted to hear the words of praise from my mother. I wanted her to be able to say, I'm proud of you. And Hannah was such an individual, no doubt she did that. And the result was Samuel grew that way. She gave him everything he needed to grow before the Lord. Everything in her arsenal as a mother was there. And then you look to Bathsheba. Now you got a question mark beside that, because the mother of Solomon, and I believe in Proverbs 31 that, first of all, Solomon did write that, but secondly is Bathsheba, who was the one who gave these things that his mother taught him. And you look at that and you think of the things that are there. You know, what is it that could be taught? Well, Proverbs 31, we look at it and we see the virtuous woman described. You know, her price is far above rubies. But you look and you find that she was one who was a teacher. You look in verses 1 on down, or verse 3 on down through verse 7. He says, Give not thy strength unto women, or thy ways, and that which destroyeth kings. It's not for kings, O Lemuel. It's not for kings to drink wine, princes to drink strong drink. Lest they drink, forget the law, pervert the judgment of any of the afflicted. Give strong drink to him that is ready to perish, wine to them that be of heavy hearts. Let him drink and forget his poverty. Remember his misery no more. You know, she wasn't afraid to look and say, okay, you're in a special position. Now today, of course, who is the child that you're bringing up as a mother? Well, your goal is to bring that one to their priesthood. You know, whenever we become children of God, we're priests. And there are struggles that are going to face every child, face every one of us. And a mother who speaks boldly, who teaches them, don't involve yourself in this. There are things that are going to come up. There are temptations that are there. Do not get involved with them. It's not for people like you. You're different. You're special. You're better. Oh, you don't want to tell them they're better? Behold, what manner of love the Father has bestowed upon us, that we should be called sons of God. I'm better. I'm not in darkness. I'm in light. And a mother who looks to their children and tells them, you know, I expect better things of you than that. God expects better things. So you don't give in to the temptations that are there. You exhort them to simply be good. Look in verse 8 and 9. Open thy mouth for the dumb, and the cause of such are appointed to destruction. Open thy mouth, judge righteously, and plead the cause of the poor and needy. I mean, you don't look and say, you know, this world's going to tell you to be self-centered, to look out. It's all about me. Do you realize what's happened to me? And Bathsheba told Solomon, said, you plead the cause of those weaker than you. You know, our world is filled with so many people that we could call Dead Sea Christians. You know, the Dead Sea is dead because it's such a low point. Everything flows in, nothing comes out. Nothing will grow there. Well, how many times do we see that in society? You know, how dare you do that to me? It's all about me. Instead of looking and seeing the needs of others, and reaching out. It's amazing how blessed we are whenever we focus not on self, but on the needs of others. That we do what God calls pure Christianity and undefiled before God and the Father. Visit the fatherless and the widow in their affliction. Keep yourself unspotted from the world, James 1 and verse 27. That purity we talked about. But that care for others. We are different. And then encourage them. You look for a proper spouse. Whenever you're looking, we all have desires. Some people look, they're out looking for a spouse. What do you look for? Well, in verse 10 through 31, he is taught about a virtuous woman. So here it is. Find somebody who is going to fulfill their family roles. You look at this. I'll just give you a few things. You go home, you read Proverbs 31, especially beginning of verse 10, going on down through verse 31. You find that they fulfill their family roles. Look for somebody that's going to glorify their spouse. In verse 23, her husband is known in the gates when he sitteth among the elders of the land. In other words, here's somebody, they are those helpmeets made for one another. He appreciates the woman that he marries. She appreciates the man that she marries. And they're known for somebody that is glorifying to others, to God. You're known. You know what a great thing it is to walk up to somebody and say, "Oh, you're her husband." Sometimes people, "Well, don't you know who I tell you what, I'm proud for somebody to come up and say, "Oh, you're Lana's husband." That's right. And I hope that sometimes the same thing's said to her about me. "You're Jack's wife." Well, that's what he's speaking of. Find somebody who is willing to live such a life that you are going to be a glory unto them. Somebody who, in verse 26, controls their tongue, their speech, in family and society. She openeth her mouth with wisdom. Her tongue is a law of kindness. If somebody is bitter, who is downgrading, who speaks evil, why would you want to marry a person like that? A lot of times, "Well, I'll change them." Rarely happens. You look and you find also that this is a person in verse 30. Favor is deceitful, beauty is vain. A woman that feareth the Lord should be praised. Teach them to find somebody that has a respect for God, that has a reverence for the Lord. I mean, you could sum it up. You think about, what does she teach them? Here's what she showed, no doubt. Bathsheba, did she make mistakes? Oh, yeah. She made some terrible mistakes. But be the kind of woman that you want your son to marry. That you want somebody to marry as they look at your daughter. You look at that and let your children see what it means to be a woman whose price is far above rubies. It's an amazing thing for, somebody to go out and look and say, "Who you looking for? Who you going to marry?" "I want to marry somebody like my mom." That ought to be a good thing. That ought to be something that somebody looks and says, "You find a woman like your mother, you found a woman whose price is far above rubies." So the mother can be that type of person. And then you look and you see Lois and Eunice. Here, the grandmother and mother of Timothy. And you think about Timothy. Who wouldn't be proud of him? Well, how did Timothy get to be that? One that the Apostle Paul could look unto him and in essence in 2 Timothy 4 say, "I'm going to die, you're going to carry on." God looks at you and he trusts you in so many ways. 2 epistles written to him. God inspired him to write to Timothy to tell him these things. Well, how is it Timothy got to be that person? You look and you find in Acts the 16th chapter in verse 1, he had a mother who stood for him no matter what. We mentioned this morning about divided households. Well, sadly that comes up. But his mother, his grandmother, they were such that even in the midst of, he was a Christian, but father wasn't, that she stood and she was that example. She's what you call a spiritual widow, but she did not let that stop her. She lived such a life that she could bring about. Remember this morning we talked about in 1 Peter 3, how that demeanor in life, even if somebody won't listen, and there it's the wife married to an unbelieving man, and without the word she can convert him by her conversation, by her life. What do you think the same thing is going to happen to the children? You know, sometimes kids have to choose, mom or dad. You know, which one? Well, be the godly example. Be that one who stands forth, that you can give answers we spoke of this morning for the things that are there. You can be the key to converting your children, just as Timothy was converted. You know, was his father an evil, despicable man? I don't find anything that says that. But it's sad that she was left alone, that she had to be the spiritual leader. But you know, if that's what's called for, you stand up. You be that one who is going to bring forth and show what it means to live in the midst of adversity. You know, whenever Paul wrote Timothy, you go through those epistles and read how often he tells Timothy about what's going to face him, about the struggles that are there. You know, he told him, he said, now you need to be an example of the believers. You know, and Timothy, wait, you're putting a lot on me, Paul. And by the way, if you live godly in Christ Jesus, you know what's going to happen. You're going to suffer persecution, but you go on and do it. You think of all the things that Timothy faced. Why is it that God thought Timothy was going to be able to stand up to whatever the trial, whatever the struggle, whatever the temptation may come, and be that example of a believer, to carry on for the Apostle Paul? Well, I think in that would be the fact that Timothy had a mother who showed him no matter what. You know, even if the closest person on this earth, you've married this individual, even if they're not with you spiritually, you can stand. His mama showed him that. What do we show? Do we show that we stand forth? Is that spiritual example even in that? You show them the importance of carrying on a chain. I've spoken of that so many times. You know, I look and I think about, you know, me as a Willliams. I had to start. But I, through my wife's strength, brought forth children who are Christians. They've married Christians. And their children, a couple of them already Christian, others on the way to it. There is a chain. You let yourself be the mother who sets forth the importance of carrying on generation to generation. And don't be afraid to tell your children. You know, we talked about the virtuous woman. She wasn't afraid to be point blank with her children. Don't be afraid to tell your children. You know, if you don't follow God, what about the generations after you? Are they going to have to overcome you as a stumbling block to follow God? You see, Timothy's mother and grandmother, they had to face the struggles. They didn't want Timothy to face that. You know, I tell my children, you know, you be that example to them. Let your children look to you. You know, I've got two amazing girls, and their children can look to them. They see the Christian life. And I hope they realize what is sacrificed to show them that, but to exhort and encourage them to carry it on. You look, and Timothy was taught so much. Whenever you look at that, you think about, I can do it. Whenever he was told in 1 Timothy 4:12, be an example of the believers. I mentioned this morning where somebody said, what's a Christian? Have I ever seen one? Can you imagine Timothy whenever he said, be an example of believers, and went on to explain to him certain things about it? I can just see, in my mind, I can see Timothy looking and say, yeah, I've seen that. I've seen that. I've seen that. That's my mom and my grandma. I can do that. I can be that example myself because they showed me, they taught me. What an amazing thing it is to have mothers like that. You look and you think about that phrase that we started with, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. There's a poem written in 1865 by a man named William Ross Wallace. Part of it says, woman, how divine your mission here upon this natal sod. Keep, oh keep your young heart open always to the breath of God. All the true trophies of the ages are from the mother love impearled, for the hand that rocks the cradle is the hand that rules the world. This world wants to tell you as a woman that if you're going to be fulfilled, if you're going to be accomplished, you've got to go out and do this or do that, make your mark in the world. If you're successful in business, that's great. I'm happy for you. But you make your mark in the world whenever you are that example of a mother to that child. You like those we looked at. And what a blessing you are to your children. What a blessing you are to those in the world round about. What a blessing you will become if those children, they follow that way. You look at your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, generations to come can swing or sway on the hand that rocks the cradle. Make sure it's a hand that's been entrusted to God. If you're not a child of God, you're not doing what you want. Well, you're not doing what you should. You see, sometimes our wants in this world may look, we're tempted, we're tried, but God says, follow me. He loved you, He loved me enough to give His Son. We make a decision to follow His will, to be that child of God, and to pass it on. I may not have riches in this world. My wife may not have riches in this world. Whenever we part from this life, there's not going to be a fuss over who gets what, because there's not going to be much left. But if we've been who we ought, we have become a child of God, and we have passed that to our children, to our grandchildren. What an amazing inheritance that is. But it starts with our decision to be somebody. What manner of love the Father has bestowed upon us that we should be called the sons of God. We talked about teaching your children that. You have to realize it yourself, first of all. If you haven't done that, tonight there's the opportunity to make that decision, to follow God and to pass it on.